On the morning of 7th November 1875, 8 boats slowly moved up the swollen waters of the Perak River, carrying with them the vengeance of an empire. 5 days earlier, the British resident of Perak, James Wheeler Woodford Birch, had been slain in the riverside village of Pasir Salak. His killing sent shockwaves through London, and the British were determined to strike back quickly before the flames of rebellion could spread further. That task fell to Captain William Innes. Hastily, with little time for planning, he assembled a flotilla of boats carrying a mixed force of European troops, Sikh guards, policemen from Penang, and Malay scouts. Their goal was simple: descend upon Pasir Salak and capture the rebels. But as a gentleman correspondent of the Times would later write, they never dreamt of the horrible disaster which was to follow. On November 1st, 1875, the British resident of Perak, James Woodford Birch, sailed up the Perak River and arrived at Pasir Salak to post government proclamations. Proclamations that gave the British sweeping powers over revenue collection, stripping local chiefs of their traditional right to collect taxes and customs duties. For the Malay chief at Pasir Salak, Maharajah Lela, this was the final insult, and simmering anger turned to violent resistance. The next day, November 2nd, Birch was attacked and killed as he bathed in a small bathhouse by the river, struck down by Maharajah Lela's men. News of the killing travelled fast, first along the Perak River, and then across the straits to Penang and Singapore. Sub-Lieutenant T.F. Abbott had been in Birch's party at Pasir Salak, but escaped the attack, reaching the British residency at Bandar Baru, 5 miles down the river. He took command of the guard there and fortified the place, expecting a Malay attack at any time. He was later joined by Frank Swettenham, then acting resident of Selangor. Swettenham had been further upstream in Kuala Kangsar, helping post Birch's proclamations. He heard of news of the murder and slipped past Maharajah Lela's stockades to get back to Bandar Baru. Bugis informants told Abbott that Maharajah Lela was preparing his men for an immediate night assault on the residency that same day Birch had been murdered. However, for some unknown reason, no attack came, to the great relief of the beleaguered outpost. News of the murder reached Penang on 4th November, and the settlement's assistant colonial engineer, Captain William Innes of the Royal Engineers, was appointed acting assistant commissioner of Perak and dispatched to Bandar Baru. His instructions were simple: to inquire into the murder and to secure those implicated. Leaving Penang in the colonial steamer Pluto with a detachment of 60 men of the 10th Regiment of Foot and 25 sepoys of the Penang Police, Innes reached the Perak River estuary late on Friday, 5th November. Innes, accompanied by 2 Royal Navy officers, Lieutenants Booth and Elliot, arrived at the residency at Bandar Baru at noon the following day. Birch's body had by then been recovered from Pasir Salak by a party of Bugis allies, and he was buried that same day in the grounds of the Residency. A funeral service was read over the grave by Mr. Swettenham, and the Sikh guards fired 3 volleys over it. Innes and Swettenham then got down to the serious business of planning the attack on the recalcitrant Malays. Innes and Swettenham had at their disposal a fighting force of about 150 men. There was a detachment of 60 men of the 1st Battalion of Her Majesty's 10th Regiment, the North Lincolnshire Regiment, commanded by Lieutenants Booth and Elliot. They were armed with the newly issued longer-range, quick-firing Martini Henry breech-loading rifle. The first time these new rifles would be used in active combat operations. In terms of artillery, the Residency had a 9-pounder Vavasour field gun, a 12-pounder brass howitzer, and rockets. Lieutenant Booth led a rocket party of 4 seamen from the gunship HMS Thistle. There were also the 47 Sikhs, who formed the armed guard of the Residency. They were recruited from the neighbourhood of Lahore and were often described as raw recruits, lacking discipline. 10 of their number had already proved utterly useless during the attack on Birch a few days earlier, when they almost immediately fled from the scene. There was also a party of 27 police sepoys, brought from Penang under the command of Superintendent Plunkett. In addition, Swettenham had a small party of 5 Malay scouts, led by the famous Selangor Panglima, Raja Mahmud. That night, they were also joined by 14 Batubara Malays, led by their chief, Nakoda Orlong. Bugis informants told the British that the Malays in Pasir Salak had constructed 2 stockades, one surrounding Maharajah Lela's house, and another to the south of the village at Kampung Biak. Both stockades were strong, with commanding views of the river, and manned by Malays resolved to resist to the death. Earthworks had been thrown up, crowned by timber palisades bristling with muskets and swivel guns, brought to bear on the river and the west bank. What awaited Innes's force was not a rabble, but a disciplined and determined fighting force, defending on home ground for a cause they believed just. The British plan was for their troops to go up in longboats and land south of Pasir Salak. The main body, including most of the European troops, would then march along the right bank of the Perak River upstream to the village, while another party of Sikhs and police would work their way along the opposite bank towards Kampung Gajah. Boats constructed to carry a gun and rockets were to move up the river alongside them, providing artillery support. At around 7 o'clock the next morning, Sunday, November 7th, the troops started embarking in 8 poling boats up the river. Much to Swettenham's annoyance, Innes had changed the attack plan considerably since discussions the night before. Innes had discovered that he did not have enough men trained to use the field gun and howitzer, and was concerned that the boats would not be able to stand the recoil of the mounted guns. So the artillery was left behind altogether. Without artillery support, dividing his force to attack both banks simultaneously became impractical. He wanted to concentrate all available firepower on the west bank for the main assault on Pasir Salak. Due to the rapid flow of the river that morning, the advance upstream was extremely slow. The first troops only disembarked at 8 o'clock, near Kuala Parit, a creek about 1.5 miles above Bandar Baru. It was only at 10:30 that all the troops had landed, and they began marching along a narrow jungle path that skirted the riverbank. The force moved slowly through the thick undergrowth. Swettenham's Malay scouts led the advance. Half of the 10th Regiment troops and the rocket battery formed a line some distance behind them. The Sikh guards, police sepoys, and the remainder of the 10th Regiment brought up the rear. After walking a mile or so, at about 11:30, the force entered a large dense field of maize. The plants were 8 or 10 feet high, and so thick that it was impossible to see more than 3 or 4 yards in any direction. They cut their way through the maize field, and the scouts emerged into a few yards of open ground where the corn had been cut down. To their horror, they found themselves standing in front of a deep ditch filled with sharpened ranjau stakes, behind which stood a tall earth and log stockade. Almost immediately, Nakoda Olong cried out, "There they are!" Before he could finish his sentence, a volley of 20 or 30 shots erupted from the stockade, and Nakoda Olong fell to the ground without uttering another sound. He had been shot through the brain. The stockade kept up a steady fire on the scouts. None of the scouts were armed with firearms, and all they could do was withdraw back into the cover of the cornfield and keep their heads down, many taking refuge behind a large fig tree. By the time the second line of 10th Regiment troops had come up, they too found themselves in difficulty. The maize was so thick, it was almost impossible to aim their rifles at anything ahead of them. At such close quarters, and with limited visibility, their new Martini Henry rifles offered little advantage to the British troops. The Malays were well hidden behind the loopholes of their wooden palisades, and their muskets and swivel guns could easily pick off anything that stirred in the maize field. The situation worsened considerably when the rear line of Sikhs and police sepoys arrived and started firing wildly towards the front, hitting the scouts and 10th Regiment troops instead. Swettenham and Innes found themselves under a murderous crossfire from the Malays in front and their own men at the rear. Plunkett vainly ordered his Sikhs to stop firing and tried to organize them into proper formation, but none of them could understand his orders. None of the officers could speak Punjabi. The police sepoys had by now long left the scene and were fleeing back to the residency. With the stockade to his front, friendly fire from his rear, and the river to his right, Innes attempted a flanking maneuver to the left. Swettenham led a group of the 10th Regiment and 2 Malays to the flank, but they were almost immediately fired upon by the Sikhs in the rear and had to retreat. The Sikhs must have been rattled as well, for they immediately bolted for the boats after that lamentable little farce. The flanking maneuver stymied, Innes tried to break through by ordering rockets to be fired at the stockade. However, at such close quarters, the rockets wildly overshot their target, flying harmlessly above the defences, to the jeers and laughter of the Malay defenders. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the force was reduced to just the officers, 4 seamen, and the surviving men of the 10th Regiment and Malay scouts. With casualties mounting, Innes took the only course left. He gave the order for that time-honoured British remedy to every hopeless military situation: to fix bayonets and charged the stockade. Rising sword in hand, Innes ordered an advance. The men surged towards the log walls of the stockade, but without artillery to clear the way, it was a hopeless task. Even those who managed to reach the ditch found its ranjau stakes a formidable barrier, leaving them exposed and at the mercy of an unseen, protected enemy. Innes was struck by a musket ball through the heart, still waving his sword, and fell to the ground dead. Both officers of the 10th Regiment, Lieutenants Booth and Elliot, were also severely wounded. The loss of their leaders was devastating. The men, who moments earlier had at least clung to hope, now broke entirely. Expecting the Malays to leave their fortifications and come after the shattered British force, a general retreat was ordered. Gathering up their dead and wounded, the British fell back to their boats and reached the Bandar Baru residency at 3:15, a battered and broken force. Total British casualties amounted to 17 men. This included 1 officer killed, 2 officers wounded, 1 private of the 10th killed, 1 Sikh killed, 1 Malay scout killed, and 8 men of the 10th wounded, 3 severely. One of the Malay scouts was thought to have gone missing, one of the Batubara Malays named Alang. However, later that evening, a search party found Alang in the Perak River. He was swimming back to Bandar Baru with the body of his master, Nakhoda Orlong, and he had an incredible tale to tell. When Nakhoda Orlong fell at the start of the battle, Alang had refused to abandon him, dragging the body to the riverbank and remaining with it under heavy fire all day. Even when a Malay from the stockade attacked and wounded him with a kris, he fought the man off and stayed beside his master. When the battle ended and the coast was clear, he dragged the corpse into the river and swam downstream with it until he was found. The devotion of this man, who risked his life to guard his master's remains, was a rare gleam of honor in an engagement otherwise marked by confusion and disgrace. Ironically, Alang and other scouts later reported that the Malays in the stockade had thought that the British were regrouping for a second, more determined charge at the stockade. The Malays actually abandoned their positions there and withdrew to a stronger stockade at the very moment the British forces were ordered to retreat. Had the British known this, they could well have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. That same evening, Captain Innes was buried with military honours beside Mr. Birch. His force had set out that morning promising swift retribution and vengeance, but instead it learned a costly lesson, that the fury they faced was no passing fit of amok, but the steadfast resolve of a people defending their land and sovereignty. The governor of the Strait Settlements, William Jervois, described the defeat at Kampung Biak as a most unpleasant shock at the worst possible moment. He feared that this military defeat might encourage discontented parties throughout the Malay Peninsula to rise up in revolt and join in opposition to the British, particularly in Selangor and Sungai Ujung. The British Empire's prestige was at stake, and a strong response was needed. Jervois issued immediate orders for reinforcements to bolster his forces, including the 80th Regiment Staffordshire Volunteers from Hong Kong and the 1st Gurkha Light Infantry Regiment from India. He needed to ensure that the next time the British encountered Malay opposition, it would be with overwhelming force. The British would not underestimate the fighting ability of the Malays again, and would quickly rectify their mistakes in their next encounter with them at Pasir Salak. Join me on Saturday, November 15th, to see what happened at this encounter in the next episode of this channel's Perak War 150th Anniversary Special. Until then, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do consider giving the video a like, sharing it with your family and friends, giving us your thoughts in the comments below, or subscribing to join me on future adventures exploring the lost chronicles of Malayan history. I remain as ever, your grateful chronicler. Cheerio.